What's up, everybody? I know that we don't usually talk about anime content on the channel. We might make jokes here or there, but I really wanted to talk about this movie right now. And come on, I made 3 Mario videos. I did the voice, I did everything. Let Keon have this one. Let me have this one. So I just saw the movie Suzume in theaters. And frankly, I could have gone and seen the Creator Clash in person, but instead I went and saw this. And I'm going to be honest with you, I feel enriched for doing so. So if you have the opportunity, right now, it's in IMAX, and I had an incredibly good time. So let's go into it. And this review is going to be broken up into 4 sections: a non-spoiler section, a minor spoiler section, a spoiler section, and then a major spoiler section. As of right now, the non-spoiler part, I think, is just going to be a big recommendation for all of you to go see it. I think it's still available, or at least it just became available where I am, and I saw it in IMAX and I had an incredibly good time. But for those of you that don't know, this is another Makoto Shinkai movie. Makoto Shinkai made Your Name, also made Weathering with You, now here's Suzume. And the major thing that I've heard about Makoto Shinkai movies is that they have like this connection and they make you think in a different way, using like fantastical elements. You think of Hayao Miyazaki movies as using like a fairy tale to tell you the story about something that you should think about. This is more like contemporary stuff. Everybody in their movies are usually using current technology, but it still has this fantastical element. And I absolutely was enchanted by this movie. I highly recommend it if you have the opportunity, go see it. But primarily, the thing that I really enjoyed about it is that I saw one trailer, did not spoil a single thing. If anything, the poster I saw on the way to the movie spoiled more than the trailer did, and it still didn't spoil very much. So I highly recommend that you go in completely blind, but even if you don't, there isn't too much out there that's going to spoil too much, except for maybe a couple of images that later on you'll be like, oh, that's where that's from. I've heard the other movies will make you cry, and apparently this one didn't make some of the people that I went and saw with that teary-eyed. It got me. It was real bad. It's not one of the most tear-jerky things. It just has some very tender moments that might get you. So we'll see. I heard Your Name was a tear-jerker. I still haven't seen it yet. Funny enough, this is the first Makoto Shinkai movie I have seen, and I gotta watch the other ones. I gotta do it now. So that was the no spoiler section. Now on to the minor spoiler section. And Makoto Shinkai has gone on record in saying that he wanted this movie to kind of bridge the gap between 2 different generations. And I think he really nailed it, because when you start digging deep into some of the symbolism of the movie, you get these elements of people that came before you and the places that they used to inhabit that are no longer inhabited, kind of ruined areas. In Japan, that's a big thing because there are villages that are just abandoned, and some of them are full of scarecrows because they started becoming abandoned, and then they just started building scarecrows to make them look less abandoned, and now they just look creepy because they have hundreds of scarecrows around. It's super creepy. I'll link a video in the below of people exploring that on like Abroad in Japan or something. It's a big problem in Japan, apparently, and what they've started doing is selling ruined property for like $5 just to make sure that people are there and populating certain areas. And I think this movie brings up that topic in a really interesting way and uses the entire idea of like a fantastical element, making those abandoned areas into a catastrophe. It's really interesting. And ultimately, it brings up a little bit of like a spiritual element about what happens to those areas if left abandoned, and spiritually what that means for the rest of Japan. And that the movie also happens to mention, because I was talking about catastrophes, earthquakes. So earthquakes come up pretty often in the movie, and I think that that's also something that on the news we've been hearing more and more about in Japan. Not only we have these abandoned, ruined areas, but we also have the idea of earthquakes. So this kind of, in my opinion, becomes a more personal movie for people in Japan. But for somebody that's been keeping up with like Japanese like news, I think is also pretty interesting because it shows the connection of those two and what that means for the protagonist, what that means for other people in the movie, and how that can create, I'm not gonna spoil it, but something, you know, in the zeitgeist, in like the culture. And so I think it's really interesting the way that they tackled it. And I think that if you go into the movie thinking about a couple of those things, more symbolism and more like legitimate visuals will jump out at you as like, oh, this is interesting. I didn't think that this would have that big of a meat on the bone for that topic. So that was the minor spoilers. Now we're on to actual spoilers, and ultimately, the movie is about a girl named Suzume. There's a title, wow! Who meets a guy who is a closer. And so what that means is he has to find these gates that are in ruined areas. Particularly, he begins by saying, hey you, have you seen any ancient ruins recently? And when I heard ancient ruins, I thought like old, but he means like maybe a generation ago. And so there's like a hot spring that's just been left desolate that's not that far away from a town, and that's where the first gate is. These gates are where this kind of beast comes out and can create an earthquake. And from what we understand, these earthquakes can just become catastrophic if they are left unblocked. The earthquake is allowed, if this monster is allowed to come out in a way that people can't see. Only the closer and other people that can see the gate can see. We realize that that's kind of the stakes of the movie. If we look at movies that I've talked about a million times, but I'll link below our episode about Everything Everywhere All at Once, where I talk about 3 types of stakes. As well as I'll mention in the comments, one of my favorite videos that breaks this up. But in a story, there can be 3 different types of stakes. There can be emotional stakes, which are internal. There can be physical stakes, which is like what's happening around external. And then you can have your philosophical stakes. So what is the philosophy of the movie? So now that we're in the spoiler section, let's break them down. So the internal stakes being the emotional stuff between Suzume and all of the people around her. So not only the people that she interacts with on this kind of road trip that she goes on, but also primarily with the closer that she meets, who I forgot how to pronounce his name, but he gets turned into a chair. And so it's ultimately ways that they can communicate and learn more about each other, but then also Suzume and her aunt, who becomes her surrogate mother, basically. She also meets other people, but those internal stakes become their relationships. Are they going to stay together? Are they going to be a unit? Or are they going to split apart and have to go do things on their own? What's going to happen there? Then we have our physical stakes, which is what's happening, which is the closer turning into a chair, as well as these gates and all of this fantastical element of the storytelling, this road trip that they go on. That's the physical thing that's happening. But then philosophically, this is the part where I think the movie gets very interesting, because ultimately it is kind of a love story. They talk about love, but since Makoto Shinkai has gone on record saying that I want this to bridge generations, is that I feel like this entire movie philosophically is weirdly about getting over death, or at least making peace with death and trauma that come from a catastrophe or some sort of natural disaster. Because since we've been seeing more natural disasters in Japan, I think that this movie particularly has a lot to say about just that. So we see that Suzume, her mom, who was a single mother when she was a child, died in a tsunami when she was 4. So since then, she's just had her aunt to take care of her, but also her aunt has a lot of trauma after that moment. And I haven't even mentioned that there are these 2 cats that are the keystones to the gate that get freed when Suzume first she's kind of the person that makes everything happen. She brings out one of the keystones, which causes all of the gates to kind of go haywire, and that keystone turns into a cat. So that cat becomes this trickster, and I feel that when we're talking about the philosophical part of this, even though the gates kind of represent catastrophe, they cause earthquakes. And those earthquakes can kill people or harm people, of course, but also that both of the 2 keystones that are keeping the gates closed, which one of them is a white cat and one of them is a black cat, I feel like are the 2 kind of pieces that make up trauma for an earthquake. You first have like the sudden surprise of something terrible happening, which I think is in the white cat, but then you also have the emotional, like, raw stuff that comes out internally inside of you that I think is in the black cat. We see that in the fact that the white cat turns the closer into a chair. So it's pretty surprising and jarring, and now everybody's just trying to pick up the pieces of that and fix what's happening. So kind of whenever a catastrophe happens. But then we also have the black cat who kind of infects Suzume's aunt's brain. So the aunt tells her that, like, you've ruined my life, you've taken my best years from me, I don't want you to live in my house anymore. Which might be true sometimes. Like, she might think of that, and she mentions it. But at the end of the day, you know, that's not all the time. Of course you love your family members, and she wouldn't keep doing it for over a decade if she didn't feel like it was necessary and she wanted to do it. So I feel like those 2 characters, though they are mentioned as gods, and they have a bit more to them, I think symbolically represent the 2 horrible parts of a catastrophe. Its surprising nature and how much emotional strain it has on you. And trauma, of course. I feel like a lot of this movie is about trauma. We have those elements, but we have Suzume who's kind of going through and acting pretty cool about everything that's happening. She's being really, like, active and nice to everyone around her. She goes on a road trip with the closer. She goes and hangs out with a girl that's delivering oranges. She goes and hangs out with a lady that owns a bar and, like, helps her out. And so all of these different levels are ways that she's just kind of coping with what's happening. It's so weird because we're all like, why is she so cool about all this? But then we find that she already kind of has gone through her own catharsis. Her mother died from a tsunami, and she found the only gate, or one of the few gates, that you can actually pass through to get to the ever after. So major spoilers now. This is like literally the end of the movie. Stop watching now. If you, for some reason, got this far, maybe you fell asleep and now you're waking up now, stop watching now. So she goes through a gate that can get you to the ever after, and the ever after is a place where, you know, people that have passed on can kind of manifest. So we think that she is going to be able to communicate with her mother. Well, fun fact, the ever after is also not only where this big worm, Dune vibes, you know, a worm that creates like earthquakes. Oh wow, it's Dune again. Sorry, my brother's gonna love that. This world is where kind of trauma stems from, and where it's also solved. So this worm is creating catastrophes, and then the people that die from those catastrophes go back into the gate. They go to the ever after, more or less. So we have the 2 cats that spawn from there, and I think that those cats are also, or like lions or whatever, they're talked about as gods. That shows the yin and yang part of it, that one's black, one's white. They're both the 2 parts that make up a catastrophe for human beings and in culture. And so ultimately, I think that the gate and the ever after was the way that we see that she's so well managed, and she's not the one that really breaks down, besides, you know, crying sometimes, because she's already experienced the most cathartic moment you ever could as a child, when her mother died, and that she wandered and found a gate, the only gate that you could actually pass through, and experienced the beginning of the movie. It's like one of the first things we see. We also see that there's a nice older woman that brings her chair. Who could that be? Well, we find at the end of the movie. The ever after also has this time cyclic element. It says that it exists outside of time, which I thought was a little weird, because I'm like, so does all of time? They said all of time exists at once, but what I think is that when you enter that gate, you and any other time you have also entered that gate are kind of sunk up. So if you as a child enter that gate when you were like 2 years old for 10 minutes, then you when you were like 20 entered it for 10 minutes, then you kind of sync up in that like 10-minute timeline. So that's what I think kind of happens, because as a child, she goes in and she's wandering and she's trying to find out what happened to her mom, and she's looking for her mom. And then we find out that the older person that she sees is herself when she's older and has already processed everything. And the reason why I think that this fits in with the philosophical stakes so well is because I personally, and for a lot of people that have dealt with trauma, I think everybody understands that when you're going through a really rough moment and it feels like you'll never get over this, hearing people that are older than you that have gone through something similar and saying it's going to be okay is nice. It's comforting. But she literally has herself tell her, it will be okay. You're gonna get over this and you'll be happy one day. You can't do that in most films, you know? You can't have your older version come to you in a moment of crisis in a way that makes sense for the plot. And this one does it perfectly, to show that after everything's happened, she solved everything. She made everything happen. She made everything work out. And after doing all that, can confront herself when she was a child and say, everything will be okay. Because it is. She did it. And showing that she as a child also gains a bit of maturity, because not only she's had to deal with this horrible thing, but she saw herself. She saw an older version of herself. And she even mentions at the end that she recognizes. She's like, I kind of knew this is what happened the whole time. I just didn't believe it. Ultimately, she knows everything's going to be okay because she has a like prophetic vision that it will. And it does. So I think that that was an incredibly cathartic moment, because I think that a lot of people that have dealt with trauma think that, yeah, things are going to be okay, but I don't believe it right now. When in this movie, we have someone see for themselves that, yes, this will be okay. It's just going to take a long time. And of course, she gives her the chair, which is a symbol of her mother. I thought that was beautiful. I think this movie also, separate from all of that, has a really interesting thing to say about the different generations. Right now in Japan, of course, there are kind of 3 generations going on right now. The kids who are going through school, you know, that are teenage. Then you have people that are a little bit older, their parents, who are not only trying to raise them, but are also trying to get over the trauma of being, you know, an adult in this world that we live in, but especially for them with natural disasters and whatever's going economically. And the reason I bring up economics is because we also see the grandfather of the closer, who's just bedbound. He sees that there's a catastrophe happening in Tokyo, and he said, I would come help, but I can't. And I think that's interesting because in the news a lot, we've been hearing that Japan's been having an issue with the elderly not being able to do too much and ultimately being cared for and taking that part of the economic system. They're the ones that need help right now, and so they're the ones that are getting some money from the economy, but the younger people are the ones that are providing and, you know, boosting the economy, and so it's going to them. There was even an economist, I think in Harvard or Yale or something, who said that elderly people should just kind of take themselves out to get rid of that burden. And I mean, he's dialed that back, and that was a pretty rough thing to say, but ultimately, that's kind of what I think is symbolized here. The elderly are the kind of people here that, of course, have a duty, and they want to fulfill it, but unfortunately, the one guy that could have helped couldn't, because he was bound to his bed. And so I see that as a symbol that not only we have these two characters that are dealing with a catastrophe in the form of Suzume and the closer, but also, you know, her aunt is trying to help a little bit later in the movie, but that we see that there's nothing that anybody else can do, and that they're the ones that are burdened with taking up the mantle of somebody that's no longer able to. I thought that it was an interesting thing to include in the movie because, of course, the grandpa's the only one that could do anything. The grandpa's the only one that knows what's going on, but they're the ones that need to make sense of everything that's going on because he can't do anything. And if anything, he's the most stern person because he understands how these things work. And it's interesting to see that intergenerational gap. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, considering we've mentioned everything about generations and what Makoto Shinkai said, hey, I want this to be about generational gap and people bridging that. Whenever they seal a gate, they have to say a prayer about understanding and enjoying the lives of the people that used to live here and understanding and celebrating the people that have left there. I don't know if that was ultimately meant to be death, like meant to mean that they've died and that these ruins are from a catastrophe, or they were meant to say that these people have moved on. They've gone somewhere else and they no longer reside here. But I think that the whole movie had a really great message to say about whenever you see a place that is derelict, you know, these liminal spaces we talk about that are just vacant, that to not only not, you know, mourn them, but to celebrate that there were people here and that this is like an incredible artifact of a forgotten place, and that there was as much culture here as wherever you live. Wherever you listening here, as well as me, wherever we reside, has as much culture and liveliness as places that are no longer inhabited. They all had a lot of incredible things happening, and then that stopped happening. They say this prayer to honor not only the people that were there, but to say that this is valued and that these people had an incredible life and that we are here to value it and not let it go to waste. And if that does go to waste, then there's going to be an earthquake. I think that that was an incredible way to show that Japan ultimately is trying to reclaim those places and do justice to the people that did live there and all of the catastrophes that have happened, and trying to pick up the pieces and make the best of a bad situation. And ultimately, I feel like that's what the movie's about. Catastrophe and how people can just no longer be living somewhere and just have to leave. You know, places go derelict because there's nobody there because either they died or we can't go through the effort of demolishing those places. They even mention that a place like an entire amusement park was left there because they couldn't even pay to demolish it. And understanding the trauma that some of these places leave behind because of a catastrophe or something terrible that's happening, but still understanding those things, picking up the pieces, and making sure that we ourselves understand that not only things are going to be better, but that we'll be able to move on and honor those people in those places and the things that happen. And I think the movie did a good job of, in my opinion, putting me in the shoes of someone who's lived through a catastrophe like that, someone who's lived through a natural disaster like that. But I feel like the intent of the movie was to give people that have gone through a horrific calamity a way to work through those emotions in the form of film. Not only the main character is that, they've gotten over, or at least are still working through the trauma of a crazy event, but also showing that it will be better and that they are better and that they've moved on. And so I ultimately think that that's primarily the point of the movie, to give people that are going through a horrible time or going through a horrible event that has left, you know, a big hole in their lives, giving them a way to process it. And I think that was beautiful. So ultimately, I just really need to talk about this. I thought about so much of that stuff when I was going through the movie, and I love talking about this stuff with y'all. So I really hope this wasn't a slog for y'all. It's okay if nobody watches this video. I just had to get it out there. And of course, you hear through my tone that I'm just like in my brain thinking about all of the different symbols I heard. And of course, I probably missed a bunch of stuff. I couldn't remember one of the main characters' names, who gets turned into a chair. I don't remember the name of the cats that are cats. I need to get the authentic experience. I've had a real problem with dubs recently. They've really irritated me unless I put them on in the background while I'm doing anything else. So ultimately, I appreciate you guys being here. Let me know if there's any more anime stuff you want to talk about, if you think that I should watch and review other Makoto Shinkai stuff, or if you think there's other anime movies that you'd like to see on this channel. This was a fun time. I had a good time. And I hope that you guys got something out of this about storytelling or about symbolism. And if you guys go do see Suzume, please let me know what you thought. And I hope you have a great day. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. Tell me how Creator Clash was. I didn't get to go. But yeah, I hope you have a good day, and thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.